Hello, let's talk about ecology. This is an introduction to this branch of science. We'll take a look at some terms, what they mean, and some examples of ecosystems. So ecology is the study of organisms, how they interact with other living organisms in their environment, along with the non-living components of the environment. So this term was first coined by Ernest Haeckel in the early 1800s. And if you take a look at the roots, ology is a root that refers to the study of. Eco refers to house. So this is the study of houses. But in this sense, a house are the parts of an ecosystem that interact. So how organisms interact with other organisms, or how biotic factors interact with abiotic factors, and vice versa. As we look into ecology, it's important to be familiar with the terms biotic and abiotic. So ecology considers how living components interact, the biotic factors, and also how abiotic or non-living components of an ecosystem contribute as well. So for biotic, think of anything that meet those characteristics of life. So anything alive. For abiotic, think of your Earth sphere. So everything but the biosphere. So that would be the atmosphere, the geosphere, the hydrosphere. Abiotic components of an ecosystem would be anything like air, water, rock, soil minus the organisms that you would find in there, right? So how those play a role in these interacting systems as well. So in ecology, we can use different frames or lenses when we're talking about how systems are interacting. We can go from very small levels of organization to very large levels of organization. So in ecology, the smallest unit that we often refer to is on the organismal level or the species level. And then we can move up to these different frames all the way up to the biosphere, which would be the largest perspective we would take. So let's take a look at each of these terms to better understand them. So let's start with the organism or a species. These include individuals that can meet these two requirements. So they need to be able to mate, and not only do they need to be able to mate, but they also need to be able to produce viable offspring that are then able to successfully mate as well. So these are individuals that can mate and make viable offspring. From there, if we have a whole group of the same species together, we can consider that to be a population of this particular species. From there, if we have several populations of different species interacting in the same area, we call that a community. So here we would have a community. We see different populations of different types of fish here, and they're interacting with different types of coral. So these are different populations all interacting to make up this community. When we have several communities together in, notice how we're going larger and larger scale, we then make up an ecosystem. When we have several ecosystems, we make up a biome. This term might be familiar from middle school. Maybe you research the desert biome or the chaparral. These are large areas that consider the living and non-living components of ecosystems and how they interact. And we can classify them into these different categories based off of several characteristics. Then when we take all of the biomes together, we get the biosphere. So this is just another term for the Earth. Which brings us to the Gaia hypothesis, which was produced by James Lovelock, or proposed by James Lovelock in 1979. And he stated that all of these organisms interact with each other in the non-living parts of our planet, and they're all connected through these self-regulating systems. And they have to self-regulate because they are trying to maintain a state of balance or this homeostasis. So now let's take a look at an example of an ecosystem. We're going to be looking at the Chesapeake Bay ecosystem as our example and the 3 communities that make up this one ecosystem. So here we're on the East Coast, and this is the largest watershed over on the East Coast. If you look at our maps here, here's where our Chesapeake Bay ecosystem is, and you can see that this is a watershed that borders several different states. So let's take a look at the different communities that make up this ecosystem. So here we have the Potomac River. This is a community that is made up of fresh water, and it is dumping the fresh water out into the ocean. And low salinity means low salt content. So all the organisms that inhabit this community are adapted to survive in this freshwater environment. So one of the only sharks that is adapted to do well in freshwater environments includes this bull shark. Pretty crazy to find that in a river. So our next community is called the estuary, and this is a place where the freshwater and the saltwater mix. So think of the freshwater from the river transitioning into the saltwater of the ocean. So we call this water brackish because it has this intermediate level of salinity. It's still pretty low, but not as low as that of the freshwater, and obviously not as salty as the ocean. So this is our transition community that contains organisms that are adapted to these brackish waters. Here's a picture of the Chesapeake Bay, specifically the estuary, where we have the mixing of the freshwater and the saltwater. And our third community is the Atlantic Ocean. So these organisms are adapted to the very salty environment. We have a very high salinity in this part of our ecosystem. So this is a good time to point out this idea of eutrophication, which is a phenomenon that happens when we have this excessive growth of algae in an area. And this is happening in Chesapeake Bay, and past tense of eutrophication is eutrophied. And what we will keep coming back to in this course is this phenomenon correlates with a lower number of species in an area or a decrease in biodiversity. And also there's less available oxygen in this environment as well. So make note of this phenomenon, and we'll continue to take a look at eutrophication throughout this course. So taking a look at biological communities, we see that these communities often lack boundaries, and this is because organisms tend to overlap into various areas, and because there is no defined boundary, this leads to organisms having specialized roles in their system, which are called niches or niches. And basically the niche that they have is essentially their job, and that is what kind of keeps them surviving in the environment, because they have a specific role to play in a system. So let's take a look at what's known as the competitive exclusion principle, which may have been covered in a previous course like biology you've taken. This basically states that no two organisms can live in the same environment if they have similar requirements or they require the same resource. So let's take a look at these two paramecium. So Paramecium aralia, living alone in an environment, you can see it exhibits logistic growth where it starts exponentially and then it meets its carrying capacity, making this kind of S-shaped curve. But this is it all on its own in an environment. Paramecia caudatum, similar logistic growth. We see the exponential leveling off. Again, this is alone, but the exclusion principle states that if these two organisms are requiring the same type of resource, like food and nutrients, in an area where they're in a mixed culture, only one of them has the potential to survive long term. So it's just too competitive for both of these organisms to exist simultaneously using the same type of resource. So that results in one of these organisms surviving and having success long term, while the other one tends to die out. So that competitive exclusion principle states that these organisms, if they're using resources in the same way in a given area, they cannot coexist. So the way in which organisms that use resources in the same way, they tend to coexist in an environment by partitioning that particular resource. So you might see different types of lizards in an environment that utilize a part of a tree, but they only utilize certain sections of the tree or define niches, and that allows them to coexist in that area without interfering with each other's survival significantly. So it reduces the competition factor. Let's take a look at predation. This is a common phenomenon you are probably familiar with, and you should know that an organism might play a role in this prey-predator relationship, which it likely probably does. But you can think of organisms as being prey or a predator, but often if you're even a predator, there might even be a predator on top of you, so you might be prey to another organism in your interacting system. So there are a lot of different ways in which organisms can successfully gather nutrients. So whether they photosynthesize or they need to prey upon another species to get their food, they develop different strategies. So in your notes, I want you guys to write down this checkpoint question and answer it. So think of some structural and behavioral strategies that predators use that allow them to catch their prey. So go ahead and record this in your notes. Think about structural and behavioral strategies. Let's take a look at prey. So prey are organisms that are trying to avoid being eaten by other organisms. So I want you guys to write down this checkpoint question in your notes and think about same thing, structural and behavioral strategies that allow organisms to prevent being preyed upon. So what can organisms do that can help save them from being prey? So go ahead and record your thoughts in your notes. Let's take a look at feedback loops in our ecosystems. And this is relevant when we're talking about predators and prey. And we can see that there are positive feedback loops and negative feedback loops in a system. It depends on what you are looking at. For positive feedbacks, we see that if we have, right here we have the predator is the lynx and it is preying upon the hare. So this is the prey and the predator, and these are interacting in an area. So the hare is trying to avoid being eaten, but every time a lynx is able to gather its food by eating a hare and then ultimately surviving and reproducing, it is able to produce more and more lynx to increase the population. So that would be an example of a positive feedback loop in this scenario. A negative feedback loop in this scenario would be the predator eats the prey, and then this population of the hair drops. But then if there are less hair available, there's less food for this predator to eat. So a decrease in food might cause a decrease in the lynx population. So we see that over time, there's a fluctuation of these different populations, an example of negative feedback. Let's take a look at this strategy. This is called Batesian mimicry. And to mimic something means to look like something or act like something. In this case, we have a snake, the scarlet king snake, that appears to look a lot like the coral snake. And the coral snake is actually a highly venomous snake, thought to have one of the strongest types of venom carried by any type of snake. But the scarlet king snake doesn't produce venom, but it looks like a venomous snake. So this is a strategy that allows the scarlet king snake to be avoided by other organisms because it looks venomous. So let's take a look at these terms that describe how organisms interact with other organisms or species. We have mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. Mutualism is describing an interaction between species where both of them have some kind of positive impact or benefit from the interaction. So here we have oxpeckers on top of a rhino. The rhino tends to have in its skin lots of ticks and mites that would otherwise harm their skin. Here the oxpeckers are kind of cleaning the rhino, if you think about it that way. They are pecking off the little ticks and mites that this rhino has, giving them food, and also the rhino benefits from this interaction because it's getting the removal of those pests. And you can see the oxpeckers are doing this not just with the rhino, but with other organisms as well. So another example of mutualism. So mycorrhizae is a fungus that grows on the roots of plants. And what this fungus does, it actually increases the amount of water that can be absorbed and nutrient absorption for that plant. And as this fungus is interacting with the roots of the plant has access to the sun. It is photosynthesizing, creating sugars. Those sugars are then sent down into the roots, and those sugar nutrients are shared with the fungus. So the fungus gets sugar, and the plant gets additional water and nutrient uptake from the environment with the help of that fungus. Commensalism is our next type of relationship where one of these individuals or organisms are benefited, they're helped, and the other one is kind of neutral. It's not harmed or benefiting in any particular way. So an example of commensalism includes cows and these cattle egrets. When cows are walking on a field, they tend to kick up grass, and in the grass there are these bugs. And as they're kicking and walking around, those bugs are released from the grass into the air, and the egrets have learned to follow the cows and capture those bugs as they're released into the air. So the egrets are benefiting because they're getting a meal. The cows, they're kind of just neutral. They're just doing their thing. But the egrets are capitalizing on this behavior because it allows them to gather their food. And parasitism, kind of a gross one, but this is where one organism benefits at the expense of another one. So there's an organism that is gathering food, getting a meal, but it's at the sacrifice of a host, in this case, an organism that is being stolen from. So you can think of a leech, lamprey. You can think of some parasites, endoparasites. Endo is a root that refers to inside. These are parasites that live within the body, like a tapeworm. Pretty gross. Ectoparasites. This is a parasite that feeds on a host organism from the outside in. Ecto is the root that refers to outside, so you can think of ticks, also pretty gross. And let's talk about just this term competition. This is a common theme throughout this course. Competition is when organisms are attempting to use or gather a resource in the same ecosystem. So they might have to compete with other organisms in their environment in order to do that. So we have different types of competition. We have intra-specific competition, which is the competition between the same type of species. So these might be males that are competing, maybe they're fighting for a female to reproduce with, but to remember this intra has an A, same with between A, same species, same intra. I point that out because there is an interspecific competition. Inter with an E, ER, different also has an ER. So this is between different types of species in an environment. Maybe these organisms are competing to get some food in their environment, and whoever wins will have access to that resource, in this case food. So this is between different species, interspecific competition.